One of the earliest and biggest epiphanies I had while learning how to draw was utilizing the power of lines, whether that's line thickness, line pressure, and line weight. I feel like lines aren't talked as much compared to things like painting or colors. So guess what? I'd like to talk about how I utilize line weight in my drawings. Hey guys, it's Cindy Kumatua, and today I'd like to talk about how I utilize lines, whether it's line thickness, line energy, and line weight in my drawings. In most cases, I pretty much prefer only using line work instead of toning my work with shades and highlights. Not because I think toning, shading, and highlights are useless, but you can get away with so much information and great drawings with just only using lines. And honestly, I think the usage of lines are quite underestimated. When I was at Sheridan College's Art Fundamentals program, drawing teachers encouraged their students to utilize lines and save things like shading, tone, and shadows for the next semester. This was to focus more on the drawing fundamentals such as shape, form, construction, and line quality and line control. I've made videos about line strokes and having line confidence in the past, but I never really talked about how I utilize things like line thickness. A lot of the things that I'll talk about here are things that I learned during my time at Sheridan College, while at the same time looking at other media and people's works. The first thing you want to do is just to practice your lines, your strokes, how you control thickness of your lines, how to control the overall strokes. There's a great practice that I kind of borrowed from BAM Animation, great YouTube channel by the way, where they have a practice of doing these curved strokes varying in thickness, and in the next stroke you're going to try and follow that path, but this time applying opposite line thickness and pressure and weight from the previous line that you did. Practice drawing with straight lines, curvy lines, sketchy lines, what kind of different lines and effects that you can come with. A practice that I never really talked about in my previous videos in order to practice your, confidence in your strokes. Sometimes I do a phantom sketchy stroke just to feel out the gesture, just to feel out the direction of the stroke. And then when I'm ready, then that's when I press it upon the surface, whether it's a tablet or whether it's on paper. The first thing I learned was utilizing line thickness to portray dark and light. This was the first tip I learned while utilizing line thickness to portray dark and light. I learned this during life drawing. Thicker lines meant to show which side is dimly lit or covered in shadow, thinner lines to show which side is well lit. And you know what? You can go beyond with your strokes. If you set the strokes to opacity and things like that, you can utilize thick and soft lines to represent soft shadows, thin, sharp lines to show that there's more of a lighting accent here and to show a bit more contrast and to create accents. Here's an example. Sometimes I'll indicate where my light source is while drawing and use that as a reference to tell me which part should be lit or which part should be darker, utilizing thinner or thicker lines. Then I'll try to draw my lines accordingly. Line thickness can be used to describe depth, whether things are far or near. This is probably the most common way in how I utilize my line thickness, especially when it comes to illustration and creating story beats or even storyboarding. Things closer to the point of view, I'll draw the lines thicker to represent it being much closer, and things far away, I'll draw my lines thinner. Here's an example. When I do illustration, story beats, or storyboarding, most of my foreground elements are treated with thick lines just to indicate that not only is it closer, but I'm also using it as a framing device. What about things that are more dynamic? So let's say a character is trying to reach towards you, to the camera. Sometimes I'll have the overall character with relatively thin standard lines, but let's say the hand is reaching towards the screen, then I'd make that hand much thicker in line quality and strokes, just to really sell it's coming towards you. You've probably seen this in some animation, especially anime, when the character is up close in your face, everything is dynamic and the lines are much thicker, just to really make that sense of up closeness really bold. I actually utilize this in my own animation, making unique frames where the lines are thicker, especially when the characters are just up close right in front of your face, and this just makes it feel like it's popping right in front of your face. Line thickness could be used to describe material, whether things are soft, whether things are hard, whether things are unclarified like smoke, they're not solid, or things that are actually solid. This one's a great way in utilizing line thickness, where I think about the type of material I'm dealing with. If the material is hard or thick or bold and sturdy, I'll just try and solidify it even more with making the lines a bit more thick and weighty. If I'm dealing with soft materials such as hair, skin, cloth, I'll make the lines thinner and softer just to really sell that softness. What if I'm dealing with characters with certain accessories? Sometimes a character is wearing like a Kevlar armor, for example. Then I would treat that armor with thicker lines. And I'll vary up the lines depending on the material that the character has, just so that the lines feel a bit more alive. Line thickness can be used to indicate intensity of energy, whether things feel weak or strong. If you want to have energetic gesture drawings or just drawings in general that has a bit of that extra graphic oomph and you can feel the life and energy, utilizing energy with line weights are a great way to go. When I do gesture drawings, I think of energy and intensity levels. If there's more energy or tension coming from something, so let's say the leg, I would treat the lines differently. Maybe I'll utilize more straights against curves, but then I'll also utilize line thickness too. And if you wanted to portray softer energy in some of your drawings, then I would treat the lines much more delicately, maybe utilizing more curves against straights. I think this usually works if you have a good handle in straights against curves and gesture drawing. I utilize this a lot when I storyboard or when I animate. My lines tend to be a bit more softer or thicker depending on what I'm animating. If it's something with a lot of action that has high intensity and strong poses, you'll notice my lines are a bit more energetic and thick. Whereas if I'm dealing with more subtle scenes, I treat things with much more delicacy. I see this utilized in anime a lot too. One Punch Man, Mob Psycho. Depending on the context of the scene, the line thickness really adds to the energy. If you want to see some great line energy or line thickness, especially in animation, look at Glenn Keane. Look at his rough pencil test specifically, and try to figure out when he's utilizing the line thickness and when he's not. I use thick lines to solidify and separate a drawing. Sometimes it's easier to solidify your drawings by just drawing an outline on them, and that is supported by its thickness. Let's say I'm drawing a character in a composition or a background, and sometimes to make the character stand out a bit more, especially if the art only has line art and some flat colors, I would just make a thick outline around that character. Again, it just makes it stand out, and it's not the only way you can make characters or things like that stand out. It's just one way. Sometimes I utilize this in painting where if I feel things get a little muddy, I'll just separate some things with solid lines. I use line thickness to arrange my composition and focal points. If you've painted before, you know how much attention strokes can deliver. I mean, sure, it's a combination of things such as color, texture, contrast, and balance, but I also feel like line thickness alone can also compose the overall picture. Imagine you're making a drawing where it's made up of thick lines, but then you created accents and focal using sharp, thinner, and smaller lines to describe those things in detail. Things with more accents, more clarity in the information tend to bring more attention than strokes that aren't really clarified, a bit loose, and maybe just too bold. The way I like to think about it is they're more of a suggestion and chunks of ideas rather than the literal, compared to the thinner, smaller, and more clarified lines. So for example, I'd have the whole body covered in thicker lines, but then the face, which I want to describe in detail, I'll carefully use much more articulate lines, and that could call for smaller lines. And of course, this can be switched up depending on how you utilize and organize it too, where the thick lines become way more of the focal point than the thin lines. And composition isn't just this black and white binary thing. There's a lot of ways you can play around with it. Sometimes a lot more information and lines can bring more attention, but sometimes if the picture is covered completely in lines but there's some bits that don't have much lines, that will create more focal point or bring more attention because of how it stands out compared to every other thing. Lines can be used to describe form. Okay, this one is kind of cheating since it doesn't really deal with line thickness or line weights, but lines can be used to indicate the overall form and describe it, something I constantly think of when I'm trying to show more of that solid drawing in my work. When I'm drawing textures or certain shapes on a gesture, I try to define the form around it. Shapes get narrower on the side if that shape happens to be a cylinder, for example. If you've seen my previous videos, I've also talked about blind contour or contour drawing, where you have to describe the form just by using lines, and you kind of feel or sculpt out the drawing with that lines. It's basically the same mentality. Sometimes you're just going to see the overall shape of a shadow or a shape of a highlight and draw around that to indicate that form. If you're considering using a cell shading style for your animation that has lighting and shadows, this is an important one to know about, especially when you're trying to define shapes of what are shadows and what are highlights and how to make that feel 3D. So that's how I utilize line thickness or line pressure and line weight. And I think this is a very crucial skill to have when it comes to drawing. People think that without lines you can't describe light and shadow, or you can't describe form, but there's so many ways you can do that just by using lines. And sometimes when I do art, I don't like to add tone and shading because I actually like how the lines look. And with lights and shadows, that's something I personally have to practice to get a better grasp on, so I don't have to always resort to just leaving my line art. But again, I'd like to emphasize that these are not rules. These are just suggestions and tips, and sure, tricks that you can apply to your own work. And experiment, break them, discover other ways you can utilize line thickness. Change it up, don't fall into a habit. Okay, that's all I want to say. Okay, bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.